Nature only needs one stupid decision before everything goes wrong. Hi, it's Christopher, and in this episode, I'm covering the dumbest animal attacks I've ever researched. From a woman who thought kissing a cobra for views was somehow a good idea, to a man who walked toward a lion pride, believing fearless people never get attacked. But first, we start with a bride who tried to outdo the Titanic pose above shark-infested water. It was the afternoon of March 14th, 2017, aboard the luxury cruise ship during a private charter crossing between Martinique and St. Lucia. The vessel had been booked for a wedding party of 38 guests, celebrating the marriage of Solange and Renaud Marcelin. Solange Marcelin was 27 years old and worked as a junior accounts coordinator at a shipping import company in Fort-de-France, Martinique. At work, she was precise and detail-oriented. Outside the office, she was impulsive, physically confident, and constantly chasing content for her social media accounts. Friends described her as athletic and fearless, someone who treated every vacation like a production shoot. She had left the wedding reception still in her gown. The ceremony had taken place on shore that morning, and the group had boarded the ship immediately afterward for a celebratory crossing. Solange had been photographing everything since before the ceremony began. By mid-afternoon, she had already climbed onto a lower deck railing twice for photos while guests watched nervously. Both times Renaud pulled her down. Both times she laughed it off. I want to pause here because this detail matters more than it seems. Renaud wasn't being overprotective. He was reading the situation correctly, and she already knew that, which is why she laughed instead of arguing. The idea that had been building all day finally came out around 3 p.m. She told a group of friends she wanted a Titanic photo, but better, not just standing on the railing with her arms out. She wanted to be lifted. The plan was for Renaud to stand behind her on the railing and hold her up by the waist while she extended her arms outward and leaned forward over the water. She wanted height, movement, and the ocean behind her. She had seen a version of it online and had been thinking about it since boarding. Renaud refused immediately. Solange found a cousin willing to help instead. The two of them climbed onto the outer railing of the observation deck near the stern, while guests gathered around them with phones raised. The railing stood just over 4 feet high. Solange climbed above it and positioned herself on the narrow exterior ledge in her wedding gown and heels, while her cousin gripped the railing behind her. The ship was moving through moderate open water, with wind gusts around 25 miles per hour. The deck surface was damp from sea spray. She extended both arms outward and leaned forward. That's when the ship passed through a wave swell at that moment, and the deck tilted. Solange shifted her weight to compensate, and her heel caught the wet metal edge wrong. Her cousin grabbed for her, but could not hold her. She went forward, over the railing, and fell from the observation deck into the ocean below. The drop was approximately 55 feet. A jagged metal drainage bracket protruded from the hull several feet below the railing. Solange struck it on the way down, opening a deep laceration across her left side before she hit the water. The impact of the fall itself caused further injury on entry. Blood spread rapidly through the surrounding water. Oceanic white-tip sharks are acutely sensitive to blood in open water and can detect it across significant distances. One reached her before rescue boats were deployed. It tore through her legs and her hands. Crew members threw locator lines and triggered the man overboard alarm within seconds. Rescue boats were deployed within minutes, but lost visual contact with Solange quickly in the ship's wake and rough surface conditions, and recovered only fragments of fabric from the water. Her body was recovered 2 days later. The recovered remains showed multiple traumatic injuries, though investigators could not determine precisely which occurred during the fall, and which resulted from subsequent marine activity. The condition of the remains was consistent with open water shark scavenging. The condition of the remains was consistent with post-mortem marine scavenging. Her body was repatriated to Martinique. Renaud was hospitalized for 10 days following her death. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as drowning and traumatic injuries consistent with a fall from height, with subsequent marine activity noted as a contributing factor. Investigators concluded the incident resulted entirely from a passenger voluntarily climbing over a safety barrier. No citations were issued against the vessel. Solange had people around her the entire time, and it still wasn't enough to stop what happened. The next case I want to show you had an audience of thousands watching in real time, and not one of them could stop it either. It was the afternoon of August 22nd, 2017, at a reptile market outside Pattaya, Thailand. The market was crowded with tourists, street vendors, and local performers. One of the main attractions was a live reptile demonstration where handlers displayed venomous snakes behind a low barrier while visitors filmed. Maya Lawson was 26 years old and had spent 3 years building a following online as a wildlife influencer. Her content showed her feeding crocodiles by hand, draping giant pythons around her neck, and letting spiders crawl across her face while laughing at the camera. Nothing had gone seriously wrong before. Her audience treated her as fearless and rewarded every reckless video with more views. Over time, that reinforcement had replaced her judgment entirely. I think this is the line that defines the whole case, and I want to make sure it lands. 3 years of content, 3 years of nothing going seriously wrong. That's not skill building, that's a clock running down without her knowing it was counting. That afternoon, she arrived at the reptile show with 2 friends and immediately began live streaming. Near the center of the performance area, a handler was displaying a large monocled cobra, one of the most common and medically significant venomous snakes in Thailand, inside a small open enclosure. The snake repeatedly raised the front of its body, spread its hood, and swayed defensively whenever anyone leaned too close. The handler warned spectators several times that the cobra was fully venomous, had not been defanged, and was behaving defensively. He specifically told Maya to step back after noticing she kept pushing her phone camera closer to the enclosure. Maya told her viewers she was going to give the cobra a kiss. People nearby stepped back. Her friends kept recording. The handler reached for her arm and she slipped around him and crouched beside the snake. The cobra lifted higher and fixed its attention on her face. She smiled at the camera and moved closer. On the first attempt, the snake jerked forward and she jumped back laughing. On the second attempt, the cobra hissed and spread its hood wider. Several people in the crowd shouted at her to stop. She leaned in a third time and puckered her lips toward the snake's head. The cobra had been signaling aggression for several minutes. It struck the moment she came within range. Its fangs connected directly into her lower lip and the side of her mouth before retracting instantly. Maya screamed and fell backward, dropping her phone onto the concrete. Blood mixed with saliva around the wound as she grabbed her face. Witnesses said her confidence vanished the moment she realized what had happened. Within minutes, she began slurring her words. Swelling spread rapidly across her lips, cheek, and jaw. She became disoriented, and her legs gave out beneath her. Monocled cobra venom contains powerful neurotoxins capable of causing progressive paralysis and respiratory failure if untreated. Because the bite occurred directly to the mouth and lower face, swelling and venom absorption progressed rapidly. Facial bites are considered especially dangerous because airway compromise can develop early, and breathing support may become necessary even before anti-venom fully takes effect. The reptile market sat far outside the nearest major hospital. Emergency responders moved through heavy traffic to reach the scene. By the time paramedics arrived, Maya had lost consciousness on the ground while her friends stood over her. She was transported to hospital in critical condition. Despite anti-venom and respiratory support, her condition deteriorated overnight. Maya Lawson died at the hospital several hours after admission. Doctors administered anti-venom, but the delayed treatment window and the location of the bite meant venom absorption had already progressed significantly before she arrived. She developed progressive respiratory paralysis and airway compromise overnight and could not be stabilized. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as respiratory failure resulting from systemic neurotoxic envenomation following a direct cobra bite to the facial region. Parts of her livestream had continued recording after the bite, and the footage spread online within hours. Wildlife experts later cited the case as an example of how repeated risk-taking without consequence creates dangerous overconfidence around venomous animals. The handler stated afterward that the cobra had displayed clear defensive warnings for several minutes before the strike. Maya's audience watched it happen in real time and couldn't do anything. Artie had no audience at all, just a vehicle full of strangers he was determined to prove wrong. I found his case harder to add than I expected, and I think you'll understand why once you hear what was going on in his life before he ever boarded that flight. It was the morning of September 11th, 2017, during a guided safari tour near the Mara River in Kenya. The group had stopped beside a muddy riverbank where several hippos rested in shallow brown water under the heat of the morning sun. Artie Pranowo was 34 years old and worked as an assistant operations manager for a shipping company in Surabaya, Indonesia. He had booked the safari alone after one of the most difficult months of his life. He had recently been suspended from work following accusations that he had approved unauthorized payments connected to missing company funds. The investigation was still ongoing when he left for East Africa. Friends later said the uncertainty had been consuming him for weeks. He spent much of the tour acting impatient whenever guides repeated safety instructions, dismissing their warnings as performances designed to impress tourists rather than genuine precautions. He spent much of the tour acting impatient whenever guides repeated safety instructions, as though the warnings were aimed at people less capable than him. I want to say something about this before we go further. Artie wasn't dismissing the warnings because he knew more about hippos than the guides did. He just doesn't want to admit he was in the same category as everyone else in that vehicle. That morning, the safari vehicle stopped roughly 130 feet from a group of hippos, partly submerged near the riverbank. The guide quietly reminded everyone that hippos were among the most dangerous large animals in Africa, and that passengers were never to approach them on foot. Artie laughed. The animals looked motionless and half asleep in the mud. He told the group the guides were exaggerating the danger to impress tourists. The guide calmly explained that hippos could cover short distances faster than most people expected and were intensely territorial near water. Artie shook his head and kept arguing. Then he opened the side door of the vehicle and stepped down into the mud. Guides shouted for him to return immediately. Artie waved them off and walked slowly toward the nearest hippo while smiling back at the other passengers. The animal remained mostly still in the shallow water, with only its eyes, ears, and upper back visible above the surface. For a few seconds, Artie appeared completely confident. Hippopotamuses are among the most unpredictable large animals in Africa. Adults weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds and can accelerate to over 19 miles per hour across short distances on land. They are highly territorial near water and will charge without prolonged warning when they feel threatened. The hippo burst from the water with almost no warning. It crossed the distance between them in seconds, spraying mud as it rushed directly toward him. Artie turned and ran, but covered almost no ground before the animal reached him. The hippo struck him with its full body weight near the riverbank and drove him into the mud. The impact alone was enough to cause catastrophic internal damage. The animal trampled him briefly before retreating back toward the water. Guides reversed the vehicle and radioed for emergency assistance immediately. The location was remote and medical help took significant time to reach the scene. Artie was alive when responders arrived, but his condition was critical. He was transported to the nearest available medical facility, but did not survive. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as fatal internal hemorrhage resulting from blunt force trauma and crush injuries to the torso and abdomen consistent with a large animal impact and trampling. Safari officials confirmed guides had warned Artie repeatedly before he left the vehicle. Wildlife authorities stated no citations were issued against the tour operator. The incident was ruled accidental, with contributing factors attributed entirely to the victim's decision to approach the animals on foot against explicit instruction. Artie walked out of that vehicle, trying to prove something to people he would never see again. Laura's case is different. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She just flatly didn't believe the animal could reach her. That distinction matters, and I want you to hold on to it going into the next one. It was October 18, 2016, during a crocodile river tour near the Adelaide River in the Northern Territory, Australia. A small tour boat moved through muddy brown water surrounded by mangroves, while several saltwater crocodiles floated nearby, almost completely motionless in the heat. Laura Kay was 29 years old and worked as a junior social media coordinator for a sports apparel company in Charlotte, North Carolina. She'd spent nearly a year saving for the trip before her 30th birthday. Passengers described her as outgoing and sarcastic. Throughout the tour, she repeatedly joked whenever guides delivered safety instructions about the crocodiles. At one point, she told other passengers the guides were talking about the animals like they were Olympic athletes. I've sat with that comparison longer than I expected to. She wasn't nervous. She had already decided nothing in that water could surprise her before the boat even slowed down. That kind of certainty is almost always the last thing someone carries before everything changes. Tour staff continuously reminded everyone to remain seated and keep arms inside the vessel. Saltwater crocodiles are capable of explosive upward lunges from the water with almost no surface warning. The warnings became more frequent as the boat slowed near riverbanks, where larger animals floated close to the surface. Laura appeared increasingly irritated by the instructions. The animals surrounding the boat looked slow and inactive beneath the afternoon heat, and she told the group there was no way a crocodile could launch itself high enough to reach someone leaning over the edge. As the boat slowed near a muddy bank, Laura stood from her seat and stepped onto the narrow side ledge of the vessel for a closer look at a large crocodile floating beside them. A guide moved toward her immediately. At almost the same moment, a passenger near the rear of the boat shouted after dropping a phone into the river. The distraction pulled attention away from Laura for only a few seconds. She leaned farther beyond the railing. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles on Earth. Adults in the Northern Territory regularly exceed 14 feet in length and can lunge upward from the water with enough force to clear the side of a small vessel. They do not telegraph movement before striking. The crocodile came out of the water without warning. It clamped onto Laura's upper body before most passengers understood what was happening. Witnesses said the animal moved so quickly that several people initially thought she had simply fallen overboard. The animal seized her, and the struggle lasted only seconds before she was pulled overboard. One guide managed to grab at her wrist briefly, but lost hold almost immediately as the crocodile disappeared beneath the surface with her. The crocodile twisted sharply and dragged her over the railing before the guides could hold on. She disappeared beneath the muddy surface within seconds as the animal pulled her away from the boat. Guides struck the water with emergency poles, and the boat engine accelerated to follow the disturbance moving through the river. The crocodile vanished beneath the surface almost immediately. Emergency services were contacted, and search teams recovered Laura's body farther downstream later that evening. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as drowning and traumatic injuries consistent with a saltwater crocodile attack, including severe crush trauma and lacerations caused by the initial bite and subsequent submersion. Local authorities stated the attack was consistent with the ambush behavior of large saltwater crocodiles, which are capable of explosive strikes even when appearing motionless moments before. No citations were issued against the tour operator. Staff were found to have followed correct safety procedures throughout. Laura leaned over the side of that boat because she had gotten the answer completely wrong. Bima's case is different in a way that I think is important. He stepped out of that vehicle because someone he loved was watching, and he needed her to see something specific about who he was. It was the late afternoon of February 3rd, 2016, during a private safari tour inside the Serengeti region of Tanzania. Dry grasslands glowed beneath the setting sun, while a pride of lions rested under scattered acacia trees beside a dirt safari track. Bima Saputra was 29 years old and had traveled to Tanzania with his girlfriend Nadine Raharja after 3 months of dating in Indonesia. The two had bonded over a shared love of wildlife documentaries and exotic animals. Friends described Bima as someone who constantly wanted to appear confident and fearless, especially around people he was trying to impress. The safari had been his idea. Throughout the week, he had repeatedly joked that guides exaggerated danger to keep tourists inside vehicles. Nadine had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the way he interacted with staff, dismissing instructions publicly and making light of warnings she could see the guides delivering in earnest. By late afternoon, the pride appeared completely inactive. 6 lions lay stretched beneath the trees, with full stomachs visible from a recent kill. Most barely moved, except for slow breathing and the occasional tail flick. After nearly 20 minutes of watching them, Bima became convinced the animals had no interest in humans. When the guide briefly stepped away to assist another vehicle with a tire problem, Bima opened the door. Nadine whispered for him to stop. He laughed and told her that big cats only attacked people who acted scared. I think about that line more than almost anything else in this case. He believed it completely, and a theory like that feels most true, right at the moment it's about to be disproven. He stepped down onto the dry grass and walked slowly toward the resting pride, glancing back at her as he went. What he never noticed was that one lioness had been watching him the entire time without moving her body. Her eyes tracked him silently as he wandered closer. He eventually turned around and walked back toward the vehicle, apparently satisfied. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Lionesses can accelerate from rest to full speed in under 2 seconds and cover 30 feet before a person can react. Walking away from a predator while alone outside a vehicle can trigger a pursuit response, particularly from an animal that has already been watching. The lioness came from behind at a full sprint, staying low across the grass. Bima heard shouting from the vehicle and began turning. The lioness hit him from behind before he completed the turn, driving him forward into the dirt with her full body weight. Nadine screamed. The guide and nearby drivers ran back, banging metal objects and shouting. The lioness retreated after several seconds, but Bima had already suffered catastrophic injuries to his neck, back, and shoulders during the attack. Emergency evacuation was requested immediately. The remote location delayed medical response significantly. Bima died before reaching a major hospital. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as hemorrhagic shock resulting from severe traumatic injuries to the neck and upper body, consistent with a large felid attack, including crush trauma and deep lacerations from bite and claw contact. Wildlife officials confirmed the guide had issued repeated safety warnings throughout the tour. No citations were issued against the operator. Investigators attributed the incident entirely to the victim leaving the vehicle against explicit instruction. Experts noted that lions resting after feeding are frequently underestimated, and that predatory instincts can activate rapidly even in animals that appear inactive. The next case has a completely different texture, and I want you to feel that difference going in. He walked out alone, in the dark, after being warned. It was the evening of March 14, 2016, at a private safari lodge near the edge of a wildlife reserve in South Africa. Dense brush and scattered tree lines surrounded the property. Animals moved through the area regularly after dark, and staff had spent several consecutive nights warning guests that a leopard had been hunting unusually close to the cabins. Adrian Volkov was 41 years old and worked as a senior marketing consultant for a real estate development company in Vancouver, Canada. He had booked the trip after months of exhaustion from constant travel, long work hours, and the recent end of a long-term relationship. During his stay, he spent most of the daytime drives pushing closer to wildlife than guides recommended. That afternoon, a ranger had pulled him back from a designated viewing area after spotting movement in nearby brush. Adrian appeared irritated by the warning and joked at dinner that safari staff treated every rustling bush like an emergency. That evening, lodge employees reminded guests not to walk outside alone after dark. I've thought about why he reached for the flashlight instead of the phone more times than I can count. The warning was specific. The leopard had been seen near the cabins on multiple consecutive nights and had not yet been relocated. Staff explained that leopards moved silently, hunted from concealment, and were especially dangerous once darkness settled across the reserve. Emergency contact numbers were posted inside every cabin. Adrian told people nearby that the warnings were exaggerated, precautions designed to scare tourists into staying inside. Several hours after dark, guests in nearby cabins heard him still awake. The area behind his cabin contained maintenance pathways and trash bins separated from the tree line by only a short stretch of open ground. Scratching and movement began outside at some point during the night. He listened to it for several minutes. Instead of calling lodge security, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside alone. Leopards are among the most capable ambush predators on Earth. They move in near complete silence after dark and remain invisible at extremely close range until the moment of contact. They are built for concealment. Their spotted coats dissolve into brush and shadow in a way that makes detection almost impossible without strong artificial lighting covering a wide area. A leopard that has spent consecutive nights hunting near occupied structures does not retreat from a single flashlight beam. It waits. An employee spotted Adrian moving alone behind the cabins toward the tree line and immediately moved to warn him. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the brush. It paused near the edge of the trees. Then it went still. The leopard came out of the brush without sound. It struck Adrian from behind, seizing the back of his neck in its jaws and driving him into the ground with its full body weight. He screamed once. The animal bit down harder across the cervical region and shook violently before dragging him toward the tree line. The screaming stopped within seconds. Workers rushing toward the area found the flashlight on the ground near the edge of the brush and blood leading into the trees. Lodge security moved all remaining guests indoors and contacted emergency services, while staff attempted to locate Adrian with vehicle lights from a safe distance. He was found at the edge of the tree line. He had sustained severe injuries to his neck, upper back, and shoulders. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as hemorrhagic shock resulting from severe traumatic injuries consistent with a leopard attack, including deep lacerations, crush trauma from bite force applied to the cervical region, and major vascular damage to the neck and upper body. Wildlife authorities confirmed the leopard had been observed near the cabins on multiple nights before the incident, and that relocation attempts had been ongoing at the time of the attack. Lodge staff were found to have issued correct and repeated safety instructions throughout Adrian's stay. No citations were issued against the property. Investigators attributed the incident entirely to a guest leaving a secured structure alone at night in a known active predator zone against explicit instruction. The last one I want to cover, and in some ways it's the one I find hardest to categorize. He wasn't chasing content, and that context is everything when you try to understand what happened on that riverbank. It was the afternoon of August 7th, 2017, along a remote riverbank inside Katmai National Park, Alaska. The group had been camping in the backcountry for 3 days when they encountered the bear near the water's edge. Stefano Marchetti was 34 years old and worked as an assistant manager for a regional outdoor equipment store in Boise, Idaho. He had grown up camping regularly with his father throughout the Pacific Northwest and considered himself more experienced outdoors than most tourists. He had never encountered a wild grizzly at close range before, but he frequently told friends that large predators generally avoided humans unless people panicked first. In the months before the trip, he had been dealing with mounting financial stress after a breakup and accumulating debt from a failed online business. People who knew him said he had become increasingly defensive whenever others questioned his judgment. The Alaska trip had been planned as a way to clear his head. Throughout the week, he had dismissed bear safety instructions from park staff as rules designed for inexperienced tourists and became visibly annoyed whenever the group stopped to discuss procedures. I've covered enough of these cases to recognize this pattern, and it never gets easier to watch. There's only so many times you can say something to someone who has already decided you don't understand the situation as well as they do. By the time they spotted the bear near the riverbank, witnesses said Stefano already seemed irritated by how cautiously the group was reacting. The grizzly was feeding along the water's edge approximately 90 feet from the group. Park guidelines required hikers to maintain a minimum distance of 300 feet from bears and to move away slowly if an animal was spotted at close range. Stefano stopped and watched it instead. He told the group the bear had not noticed them and that backing away would only draw attention. One friend quietly suggested they move. Stefano dismissed it. He took several steps closer to get a better look, telling the others that the bear was focused on the river and would ignore them entirely if they stayed calm. the bear raised its head. Grizzly bears detecting humans unexpectedly near a food source will often respond with a defensive charge. Running accelerates that response. The distance closes faster than any person can cover on foot. The bear turned and charged. It covered the ground between them in seconds. Stefano turned and ran, which accelerated the animal's response. The bear reached him before he covered 20 feet and struck him from behind with enough force to knock him off his feet. The attack was brief but concentrated. The bear bit down on the back of his neck and upper shoulder before the group's noise and movement caused it to break off and retreat toward the tree line. The group reached Stefano within seconds. He was conscious but unable to move. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but the remote backcountry location meant evacuation took several hours. Stefano was airlifted to a trauma facility, but did not survive. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as fatal cervical spine injury and hemorrhagic shock resulting from crush trauma and bite injuries to the neck and upper back consistent with a grizzly bear attack. Park authorities confirmed the group had received full bear safety briefings before entering the backcountry. No citations were issued. Investigators attributed the incident to the victim approaching a feeding bear at close range against established safety guidelines.